Thank you guys all for coming today. I'm so delighted to have such a great crowd for these wonderful artists that are here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sasha Reebstein. I am the director of the Boehm Gallery. This is my first show as director. And I couldn't be more excited to have these two. We've got Veronique d'Entremont here, whose work I first saw well over a decade ago when she was an undergrad at Massachusetts College of Art. And she was creating these wonderful home structures out of wood that she was casting iron into, and they were leaving just this lacework of the home. I was really taken with, and I always wanted to look her back up. And taking over as director, I found out she's just up in Los Angeles, so I felt really fortunate that we could bring her in to do such a massive installation. She got her graduate degree at UCLA, and she's currently living and working there and teaching at UCLA. She's also a community organizer and is working to bring arts to diverse communities up in Los Angeles. We also have David Willburn, who I'm delighted to have. He flew all the way from Fort Worth, Texas to be here with us today. I saw his work at Helmuth Gallery down in San Diego and was really taken by the contemplative nature of the work, how thoughtful it is, his simple use of form and color and layering of materials. He teaches at Eastfield College in Texas, and just couldn't be happier to have you both here today. Their work looks so different. You know, at first blush, they seem so dramatically different, but I think there's a really wonderful overlap between their exploration of personal landscapes and domesticity. And so I hope you spend enough time to start to appreciate the resonance between them two, as well as each of their individual styles. So thank you for being here, both of you guys.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you. So I guess I will begin, since you both left me. You know, I was at Miramar College yesterday to meet with a couple of classes, a few classes actually, and I guess I should say like boo, hiss, Miramar, but it doesn't work that way. Y'all don't care. Neither do they. And I spoke for 3 hours. So today I'm going to go for 4. So I hope you're comfortable. I hope the temperature's good. I'm going to give you about 20 minutes, right? That's good enough. I'm going to give you 20 minutes, which will most likely work like this. I'm going to talk. Most of it's rambling. Some of it's going to be some bad jokes. Hopefully you'll indulge me by laughing anyway, and then at 20 minutes, Sasha will signal me and I will just stop. And wherever I am, that's what I do. So anyway, I'll get started. It's amazing to see so many people in here. There's a chair right here, if anybody would like to claim it, or I might. If you're standing in the back, could you just do me like a favor and just sort of like have an awareness of what's behind you, so as you like decide to make yourselves comfortable and lean up against the wall, just make sure that there's not an artwork that you're rubbing your beautiful face all over. So I'll get started. My name is David Willburn. I am from Texas. I grew up in Texas. I was born in Fort Stockton, Texas, which is near-ish the Big Bend area of Texas, which is that bottom dip at the bottom of the state. Not the very bottom, not the little point, but the dip just above it. It sort of goes like this, and that's formed by what body of water? The what? The Rio Grande. Right. Thank you. The Rio Grande. And so I was born in Fort Stockton, nearish that. When I was 3 years old, I moved with my family to Amarillo, Texas, which is at the very top of Texas in what we call the Panhandle. That's the square part. Because my father worked for the railroad. He worked for Santa Fe Railway, which is no longer around. They've merged, I believe, with Burlington Northern, another railway. Mostly freight. That's what they moved and continue to move. Sometimes people, but mostly freight. Including all of our furniture, all of our belongings. And we moved up there when I was 3. And I lived there for about 10 years until my parents divorced. My dad left home, the jerk. And then I moved with my mother and my brother, who's a year younger than me, down to Lubbock, Texas, which is in the very center, kind of at the very center of Texas. Very flat, very flat, boring, sort of minimalist landscape. If you've ever seen a minimalist painting, like a Mark Rothko, who's not quite minimalist, he's more of a color field painter, but it's like color, line, color. That was Lubbock, Texas. And that's why many of my friends today who have been to Lubbock say, well, now I get it. I know why you're an artist, because you literally had to create your own environment. You create your own landscapes. Maybe that's true. I left Lubbock, though, when I was 18. I met a guy who was a student at Texas Tech University, a great school in Lubbock. He was a psych major, and he was graduating, and we met, and we fell in love, and he was headed back to Dallas, and I went with him because I was like, this is my ticket out of Lubbock, Texas. And so thank you, Scott, for getting me out of Lubbock, Texas. I'm going to say that to the camera. And so I went there with him, and I started working at Target, stocking back-to-school supplies. Did someone applaud? I thought I heard applause for Target. Yay, Target. Yay, job. And so I started working at Target, stocking back-to-school supplies, and a woman that I worked with, her name was Vicky, literally saved my life because I had no college plans whatsoever. And she came to me and said, hey, David, I'm going to Eastfield College tomorrow to register for classes. You're coming with me. And I was like, no, I don't think so. Like stocking a pencil. I think I'm good. Thanks, Vicky. And she was like, no, David, you're coming with me. And so I was like, okay, they're not going to want me. So I went there, I registered, I enrolled, I took some tests. I realized how very, very bad at math I was. And I had to basically start over on my math, starting at it was like a 9th grade level. It was that bad. But I'm telling you that because it was so wonderful that, that they let me in, that they let me become a college student despite the fact that there were clearly some gaps in my education, despite the fact that I clearly was not what we in academia like to call college ready. Like that's actually such a thing, and I don't really know what it means, and I've been teaching college for almost 15 years now. That's all to say, I know you. I know you. I know Palomar College. I know community college. I know two-year academic institutions, and I believe in them, and I believe in the transformative power of this kind of place and this kind of environment, and sitting out here getting to listen to art superstars like myself. And so it's exciting. It's always exciting to stand in front of my own students, and especially exciting to stand in front of somebody else's students. And just talk and tell stories, and eventually get to the point of your being here, which is my work. I live in Texas. I live in Fort Worth, Texas, with my husband, whose also name is David. Sorry, Scott, you've been out of the picture for a long time. Thanks for getting me to North Texas. But I live with my husband, David, and our 2 dogs. My studio is in my home. I went to grad school in Vermont at a tiny, tiny private institution called Vermont College of Fine Arts. They had a very sort of craft orientation, handicraft, like this kind of stuff, working with needle and thread and collage and handmade paper and photography, but not the kind of photography that you and I are taking today, but the kind of photography that requires chemicals that are kind of toxic and getting things wet and dirty and alternative processes. And so I was very grateful for that experience. And then I ended up back in North Texas after Vermont College of Fine Arts. 2 days, literally 2 days after I walked across the stage and received my diploma, I got a phone call from a former professor at Eastfield College saying, hey, David, we need someone to teach 6 art appreciation classes here at Eastfield College. You want the job? And I had no idea what that meant. I had never taken art appreciation as a student. And I was like, sure, because that sounds like money. And I took them. And I had to invent them as I went along. But I'd walked across the stage and got a full-time job, which is unheard of. I mean, ask around. I'm so lucky that this accidentally happened to me, because you just don't do that. You don't walk across the stage and get a full-time academic teaching appointment. That turned into a permanent position. I applied for it, competed with all of my friends to keep my own job, and I got it, and I kept it. So I often tell my friends and my students, like, if you stick around at Eastville College long enough, we'll just start to pay you, because I feel like that's what happened. I started working with fibers, with fabric, with needle and thread, with hand dyeing materials, sometimes my own clothing that I would cut up into pieces and stitch together into larger panels. Ultimately, though, I started working almost exclusively with muslin, the fabric, because I love the fabric. I love the way it looks. I love the weight of it. I love the fact that you can see when you look closely at a piece of muslin, you can see, it's like you can see the history of the making of this very ancient fabric. You can see like little remnants of this, I guess the seed holes in the fibers of the weave, which I think is fantastic. It's like it's telling its own story of where it came from. And I am using the fabric along with some other materials to tell a story about myself and about, in many ways, where I came from and who I am and why I am who I am. So I started using embroidery late grad school, and I started making pretty straightforward drawings. I refer to all of these as drawings because of the very strong linear element. I'm just making a drawing rather than with a pen and ink or a stick of charcoal or even a paintbrush with watercolor. I am using a needle and thread to make the same kind of line that you would make in your sketchbook with a pencil. I like it because all of my work, I like embroidery because all of my work is about my home. It's about domesticity. It is about the act of living and operating daily in a home environment, whether it's my home or whether it's your home. But it just so happens that I'm in my own space, and so I am using my work to document the use of that space, the history of that space, and the daily rituals of that space, the way that my husband and I, the way that our two dogs occupy spaces. So I'll just tell you about what you're looking at and why they look the way they do. So I said I started out by making pretty straightforward drawings of like a dining table or the corner of a sofa. If you go to my website, you can actually see some of these earlier images. There's a drawing, it's one of my favorites, on a gray felt panel of my husband. It's sort of shot at an awkward angle, like I'm up here looking down at him, and he's sitting in the sofa with his hand on the back of our dog, our oldest of two dogs, named Tao. And it's unfinished, the drawing is, because I think that in many ways I'm unfinished, or we are unfinished, or you are unfinished, or this sort of act of living, thinking, breathing, occupying a house, having stuff in the house. It's like always in this state of a kind of flux. It's always moving, it's always changing. And so for that reason, many of these early drawings are unfinished, as though they're not complete, or as though they are in some sort of undergoing an act of erasure, like I made the drawing and then I went back somehow and either pulled out threads or erased the thread drawing. Not only are they unfinished, but the threads are left, like in this one, the threads are left to hang, as though we, as viewers, are witnessing the unfinishing of the work, as we're witnessing it like unraveling like a bad sweater, you know, when you pull the string and it just unmakes itself, or you unmake it as you pull. Eventually, though, I became less interested in the objects themselves that I was recording. I became less interested in making documentary images of the chairs and the lamps and the furniture and the things that we engaged with on a regular basis. And I became more interested in the subjectivity of these objects, or in the essence. Like, it's less about how the thing looks, because that felt too specific, and it became more about how I feel about that thing, you know, which is really the basic difference or definition of objective and subjective. Objective is like the object. It's about the facts. It's about what we literally see before us. And subjective is like an emotional response to the object, which is something that you'll encounter often when you're looking at works of art. You're going to hear people talk about, and you yourself will talk about, like, you know, an objective response versus a subjective, or objective reading versus subjective reading. So I became more interested in the subjective element, or the essence of the object. So I started to abstract away the information, and I started to, using a computer, I started to digitally remove evidence of what the object is or what the object used to be, to reduce it to what I hope, what I think of as an interesting composition of formal elements like line, shape, color, texture, or principles like pattern or balance. And that felt very liberating. Once I removed the objectness, once I removed the sofa or the coffee pot or the dog or the human, it was like I could suddenly allow you, the viewer, into the work. It was no longer specifically about me and stuff. Instead, it became about other things that you could step into, other things that you might find interesting. I'm interested in I guess you could call it geometric abstraction. There's a lot of geometric elements in my work. That is a result of the abstracting process that I use a computer for. Let's see, what else? I'm interested in...
3-minute warning.
Okay, thank you. Wow. I'm interested in a kind of, creating or documenting a kind of mapping. I look at my work and think of them, these pieces, as kind of maps or kind of landscapes, as though like you're looking at a topographical map or environment. In some examples, like these two right here, these are actually titled Mapping, Mapping 1 and Mapping 2, because I'm actually tracing with thread, I'm tracing the lines created by the wrinkles in the fabric. So I take the piece of fabric and I will wad it up, and then I will draw the lines created by those wrinkles, creating these sort of interesting clusters. The clusters of lines create interesting shapes. And then I flatten the fabric back out. I wet it, I iron it, removing all the wrinkles, removing evidence of those original lines, and then I'll add some sort of paint element. I create paint skins, which is just pouring acrylic paint onto a sheet of plastic. If you haven't done this, you should try it. It's really amazing. You can make great collages with acrylic paint skins. You pour the paint on a piece of plastic and you let it dry, usually overnight, and then you can peel it off. And it's like you have this sheet of pigmented plastic that you can then take a pair of scissors and cut into any shape, and you can build up surfaces and layer colors together. And it can be a lot of fun. So that's what's happening here. That's what's happening here. This paint was a little bit thicker. This paint had an additive that I added to it so that it would have a nice flatness to it with no bubbles. Let's see, what else? I feel like I'm kind of rambling now. All of these circular pieces that you see around the room are self-portraits, or I think of them as self-portraits for two reasons. Reason number one, I am using a mirror on a stick to take selfies. So I'm holding a mirror and I move around my house and I take a picture of my reflection, which is mostly my phone, if you can imagine, and then some information about the environment so I'm around me. So I'm still documenting part of my home, but I'm now adding a couple of other layers. I'm adding the layer of the digital device used to make the documentation. I'm adding the layer of my head that you can see around that digital device. I'm also adding a sort of metaphorical layer of the reflection, of seeing, looking at myself in the mirror, presenting myself and my environment in the mirror, and then sort of projecting that back out to you, but it's all been abstracted. Some of these pieces back here, these three pieces, these hanging panels with various devices on top of them, they're titled In My Room, which is a pretty literal reference to my process of making these drawings, moving around the house from room to room, documenting myself literally in my room or in my rooms. I'll stop there. Do you have any questions for me? Yes?
Do you have trouble sometimes knowing when to stop on a certain work?
Yeah, almost always. Almost always. It's not always a struggle, though sometimes it really is a struggle. Like I don't know what to do with this piece, so I'll just walk away from it. I'll set it aside and I'll start working on something else. And then I might come back to it later with an idea about how to finish it, or I come back to it later and think, well, you're done. Like, it's done. I'm just going to like put a period at the end of that sentence and call it finished. But that's always a question, and I think it should always be a question. If you're an artist and if you plan to continue to study art and continue to make art, you should always be engaged in that internal conversation. Like, when is this piece finished? Is there anything else I can do to this piece, or have I done too much? Do I need to withhold? Do I need to go back and edit? So yeah, short answer, yes, always. Long answer, everything I just said. Yes?
When was the point that you realized that you actually wanted to become an artist?
That is a really good question. It's funny, I don't often think about the answer, and I should. And so thank you for making me think about this answer that I'm going to try to give you right now. I think, like most people, and this probably sounds so cliche, but I probably knew, when I was a kid. I think a lot of us know when we're a kid that making art is awesome, right? That's really one of the first ways in which we communicate as human beings, right? We make drawings, like mom or dad or some grown-up gives us some sort of mark-making tool and some surface upon which to make those marks, if they're lucky, because if they don't give us a surface, we're going to find a surface. And if they don't give us a mark-making tool, we're going to invent one. Sometimes it's stinky, but we're going to make one. And so I think, from a kid, from early on, I knew that. And then as I got up through school, things started to change. I still loved making art. I still loved drawing and painting and making stuff with wood and clay. But the logical brain took over, and the adult brain took over and said, oh, but you need a job. You can't be an artist and have a job at the same time, because that just doesn't make sense. And then when I first went to Eastville College, I majored in business administration because I was like, that's going to get me a job. That sounds super fancy. I'm going to have a nice car. I'm going to get to wear a suit, and that sounds so important. It's all about power. And then I took an art class, and I was like, bleep this. Like, this is awesome. This is messy and weird, and I feel messy and weird, and I'm surrounded by all of the messy, weird people who look and act like me, and it was great. So I was like, screw it. I'll figure it out, but I'm going to be an artist. And so far, it's stuck. I remember my dad telling me when I said I'm going to be an art major, he said, you can't do that. Like, you're going to end up drawing caricatures at the state fair if you major in art. And I was like, really? They make money for making art. Like, yes, sign me up. So that totally backfired, Dad. Any other questions? Hey.
Have there been any artists that have influenced you strongly?
All of them. Like, all of them. That's a terrible answer, but it's really kind of true. Yeah, there have been some artists who have really challenged me and who have inspired me, and some who have made me think like, God, what you're doing is terrible, but it's so interesting because it's making me angry. Tracy Emin is an artist. She's a British artist. She's sort of like a bad girl artist. Like, she like smokes and drinks and cusses and gets in bar fights. And she stitches. And she embroiders. And she makes these sort of delicate, like, women's work kind of things. But then she'll like, she'll kick your butt if you get in a fight with her. And her works are like really aggressive and bold and sexy and naughty, and I just thought like, wow, like that's amazing that she's doing that she's sort of challenging that history of like, women's work. Like, I'm going to, tat doilies and make lovely quilts. And that's what got me started doing that. I was like, well, what happens when a man does it? What happens when a man does traditional women's work? What happens if the man is gay? What happens if it's a gay man who also lives in Texas, which is a pretty conservative part of the universe? Bleep you, George W. Bush, I'm stitching. Like, I'm queering it up over here in your home state. And so, yeah, Tracy Emin was a really big motivator. I owe her a thank you note, but I'm afraid of her, so I'm not going to try to make contact because she makes me nervous.
We'll take one more question.
Often art is based off of tension, sometimes that we create, sometimes that we observe. And so I wonder, in this domestic environment that you live in, that you habitate, do you also manipulate the things in your domestic environment, or do you habitate it? I know some people, like, their house is the box that they live in, and others, it is their canvas. And so,
yeah.
Do you manipulate the subject matter as well, or is that maybe...
That's fantastic. Thank you for, like y'all are great. You're, like, making me think of stuff. Yeah, I really do. And I think a lot of us do. I'm constantly, I think the reason I'm drawn to this subject matter is because I really enjoy this subject matter. I remember when I was a kid, we were like a pretty blue-collar working class family. And so we didn't have a lot of money, and I remember as a kid looking through the Sears catalog, which most of you have never seen a Sears catalog. It was called the Wish Book. Because it was really all about looking through the pages at the beautiful photography of the beautiful things. I wasn't looking at toys and bicycles, though. I was looking at, like, kitchenettes, and I was looking at living rooms. Not because I wanted to, like, play mommy or play house, but I was like, I want my family to live there. And so I grew up thinking about what it means to have and to be domestic, and to have a space, and to use an overused word, to curate a space, and to constantly work it almost like it's a garden, And so I do. I like, my husband and I, we're typical Americans. Like, we're consumers. Like, oh, that sofa is 4 years old. Got to get a new one, And so I think about that. I'm like, great, something new for me to document. And sometimes I literally manipulate the subject matter. I'll take a chair and I'll turn it on its side and I'll put a lamp on top of it and balance a candlestick on top of that. And then I'll go to all of this trouble, I'll photograph it, and then I will abstract the hell out of it so that you have no idea all that goofy stuff that I just did. But that stuff was necessary for me to get to a point where I feel like I can make a drawing out of it. It's so weird, but it's so fun being an artist because you can do stupid stuff like that. And with these kinds of exceptions, you usually don't have to explain it, You can just say, just look at the work, and say stupid things like, your meaning becomes the meaning. Thank you. This was great. This was really, really good. Thank you so much.
Basically, I guess I sort of wanted to start out by just saying where I come from in terms of making art. So I'm an artist and I'm a teacher, and I believe really strongly in art as a form of teaching, and also art as a tool to reflect whatever the place that you're at in whatever moment in life you're at, and that art is a reflection of where you're at, and also art as a tool to communicate, and also a tool to achieve different things. And I'll maybe get into that a little bit more later on in the talk. It's funny that you mentioned that work from undergrad, because in a lot of ways I feel like this installation, as you're seeing it right now, I actually showed it earlier this month in Los Angeles, because I had it all installed in my studio in Los Angeles, and I thought, well, I should just have a show in my studio and show this thing that I put so much effort into installing before I reinstall it, drive it all the way over and reinstall it. So it actually, somebody during that show had asked me how long it took me to build, or how long it took me to put together. And I said, well, it took me about maybe a month, but in reality, the ideas that are in that piece, and some of the visual elements that are in that piece, and the recordings that are in that piece, that I've been working on that piece for the past 15 years or so. I mean, it's the recordings that you can listen to on the telephones. The first one of those I actually recorded when I was 16 of my grandmother, and I've been recording conversations with my grandmother since then, every few years, and then now it's sort of like every conversation we have I record, because I'm obsessed in that way.
No, I didn't want them to take me away from this, And so I said, oh, it's like an orgasm. I thought, Jesus, she flipped.
Things that have kind of lodged in my brain as an idea or as an image over the years, and I've just kind of kept them in my back pocket. And I think that that's actually something that I recommend to students when somebody has you have this idea but you don't know exactly what it means or how to get it out or how you want to do it. Just don't force it. Just kind of keep it in your back pocket, and maybe now isn't the exact right moment for that idea to come to fruition, but then you'll have that and it'll come into something else. And really having this opportunity has given me the chance to reflect on some of my older work and reflect on the ways that I keep revisiting these ideas, and I'll start in this one place and I'll go over here and I'll come back here, and then I'll go over here and then I'll come back here, and it's not, I don't have this real linear progression in terms of my art practice. I feel like in a lot of ways I keep coming back to the same idea with different visions of it. And so I think that actually a lot of the time I will begin my slide lectures with that work that I did in undergrad, which just to give an idea, I was building these complex sort of like faceted shapes out of plywood. and then I would cast molten iron into them, and they would erupt in flames because plywood is like really, really flammable, and just the construction of them would just sort of like, it was actually like quite a scary fire, and a couple of people got injured pouring them, and I'm sorry. But the resulting casting, so the plywood would burn away, and the way that I had constructed them, what I would be left with is this sort of dollhouse scale, either a house that looked like it had burned down or a church that looked like it had burned down. And I didn't really know what it was about. Like I was kind of I was making these things, and I was like really angry, and I wanted to burn stuff, and I didn't like religion, and I used this imagery of like a destroyed home or a burned down home in like these different ways, and I didn't really have the words to articulate it and what it was about. And also during that time, I was doing a lot of photography inside of abandoned mental hospitals. I started photographing abandoned mental hospitals actually when I was in high school, and I continued that for years, going around the whole Northeast and finding different hospitals and photographing them. And I mention that because I feel like both of those series I've revisited in some way with this work, maybe content-wise in terms of the religious aspect, and kind of definitely a different relationship to religion, but also like definitely the visual and aesthetic aspect of those abandoned buildings, and these spaces that I would go into, and it literally looked like people just picked up one day and they walked out, and like they would have photos were still on the wall, and there were clothes still in the closet, and all of these artifacts of the people that had been there were still there, and some of them had been taken, but some of them were left. And the only way that I could imagine capturing that was through photography, and then eventually, as I began to work more in sculpture, I began to do a lot of work that was like photography in the sense of sort of evidence or an index in the sort of semiotic language, or proof of something. So I would do castings, because to me, castings and photography are really related. A casting is like a photograph in three dimensions. So actually, I would take like old not scrap, but building supplies or architectural elements or domestic objects, and then try casting into them. So I would make a mold out of these domestic objects and furniture and cast clay into them, which the first one just totally exploded. And then I made a piece called Piecing It All Back Together, because my titles are quite literal a lot of the time. So for me, the process of actually making this thing and then having it explode, and then needing to dig through all the rubble in the kiln and find the pieces and then reassemble it, like that became really part of the process and part of the piece. And I wanted the final piece to have evidence of that. So there's a real connection. Obviously, this is not a slide lecture, so I can't show you, but there's a real visual connection to a lot of my work. But I, up until quite recently, hadn't begun working with those actual found objects as the art object. They were always the means to making the art object. So they would be the mold, and then the final piece was clay. Like I did a piece where I took 300 pounds of clay and I sandwiched it, smushed it between, a window and a dresser, and stuck the whole thing in the kiln. So this process that had made the clay strong, firing it, burned away the objects that shaped it. And so it was this whole process that was sort of an allegory for this story about like how maybe you're shaped by your surroundings, and then like they go away and you're strong, something like that. In any case, so that content was always really masked in this sort of like formalism and abstraction, and partially I think that was because I'm like looking to Sasha because she got her MFA at the same place, Massachusetts College of Art, that I went to undergrad, and I think that art school in general I don't think really, my experience was that personal stories and personal content was not privileged and was not really allowed, or I never felt like it was really allowed. And so my personal content and my personal story was always sort of like masked in these layers of abstraction and these layers of like art materials, like, oh, the final thing is made of clay, it's a sculpture, or like plaster. Those are sculpture materials. And so I think that my last semester at UCLA, that really shifted for me in a huge way. And so this, the write-up on the wall says this, but I'll just also mention that the first recording that I ever recorded of my grandmother, I recorded probably just a few months after my mother killed herself, and that was when I was 16. And so I think that in some ways I was always sort of like revisiting this content and revisiting this like space and this time and this idea of this, like searching for answers. And that's also like a huge, like something that I really value in terms of my art process, and that I try to encourage in terms of like the way that students use art, that it's like a path of inquiry. It's a way that I find answers, and it's a way that I find hidden answers that are maybe something that I don't have the words for, but I can bring out into the world through visual aspect, or through visual means. And so that story has always been there, like lurking in the corner of my artwork and lurking behind behind maybe sometimes formalism and sometimes abstraction. But my final semester at UCLA, I decided, it happened as a result of something that happened to me, which is that I received a suicide note from my mother that I didn't know existed. And it was like all of a sudden this thing like pierced through space and time and like came to me, and I was like, what am I making in terms of art? Like, what am I doing? And I love the art I love the art that I made at UCLA and the art that I made during that time. I'm not at all discrediting that work, but it really it was like all of a sudden I had this thing that was really real, and it just like pierced through all of that kind of like academic baggage in a way that I think I had like started to lug with me over the years, like professors being like, oh, you shouldn't do that, or like, oh, people don't care about feelings. What is this, art therapy? I don't think that anyone actually literally said that, but that was what I heard in my head. And so I thought to myself, this was actually after my thesis show, I thought, well, I have an MFA now. Like, now I'm going to do an art project called I Talk on the Phone with My Grandma, and it's art because I have my MFA now, and what are you going to say? So that's what I mean when I say using art as a tool. So, and I guess that's also like using my credentials as a tool. So like the credentials that I received from UCLA through my artwork, then I could say, okay, well, I'm going to do this thing that really I just want to do, talk on the phone with my grandma, and I'm going to call it art. And that was that I ended up also making an installation around that. And that was also my first real step into installation. And I didn't use the actual audio. I printed transcripts because it was still a little too real. And so this has been the first chance that I've had to actually use that audio that I've been recording over the years. Geez, I mean, right before this talk, somebody came up and asked me a bunch of questions that actually people have asked me similar questions when I had the show up in LA, and I guess they're sort of about like, oh, what does this mean? What does this mean? And I think that also I will address those, but I think something I also wanted to say in terms of maybe this is like my position with this, but also my position as an artist and as a teacher, is something that also came up for me that I began reflecting on when I was making this, is just how being specific with your art, like having this very specific idea of what you want to communicate, makes the work stronger, but you don't have to make sure that that's what everyone gets. And I don't know if that makes sense exactly, but a few people have said, is there a specific thing you want me to get from this installation? And there's very specific stories that I have in mind with that. There's very specific reasons that decisions were made, but I'm actually, in a lot of ways, more interested in how people relate to the space and the stories that you all end up bringing to it. So one thing I'd really love people to do is I want to make sure everyone knows you can walk through the installation, you can pick up the phones and listen to them. Please do that. Feel free to sit on the cushions. That's what they're there for. And also, if you want, I left a book on the front desk that if you want to write what your thoughts are and your impressions or anything you thought, I would love to read that and hear that too. But I will kind of go through the pieces and talk a little bit about them. All right, so I'll talk about the net, because that's the reoccurring theme. The net that's that's displayed on the outside, that sort of three-dimensional net that comes down in a cone, that is really about that moment where I received that note and it's pierced through space and time. And I started thinking about, okay, so it's like time travel. All right. So a wormhole is how you travel through time. I'm not sure if people know this. The way that a wormhole is formed is that an object that has so much mass, like a planet, pierces through, and it pierces through the fabric of space and time, and it creates a wormhole, and then you can travel through time. So then I started thinking about what happens, maybe there's objects here on Earth that have so much emotional weight, so much emotional mass, that they can actually pierce through space and time and create a wormhole, and you can time travel. So that was this idea that I was spinning out on for a while, and I made this whole installation, and et cetera, et cetera. And that is also, that's sort of thinking about that idea, but also thinking about it in relation to these telephones and taking telephone wire and then weaving a wormhole out of telephone wire and thinking about the relationship of these objects, these telephones, as devices that help me go back in time and listen to these recordings that I've listened to, and also that could be something where you're kind of going back in time, and there's this nostalgia element to them because some of them are rotary phones, but it's really about going back in time and listening to the proof of these conversations, these recordings, which also sort of reflect that idea of proof or photography or casting. The net on the inside of the installation is a little different. It's not different, but it's another way of thinking about netting, and this idea of this grid that I was looking at, this grid, this space and time grid, and thinking about grids. And grids are things that we align ourselves to. They're the things that we don't think about. A grid is something you align yourself to. An ideology is something you align yourself to and you don't really think about it. And culture is something you align yourself to and you don't really think about it. It's just the stuff that's around, it's air, it's wallpaper. And so that's why there's the wallpaper that is the net, that is that sort of grid. But then also it kind of comes down and it's literally a net, in the room. So I imagine everyone has not had a chance to listen to the phone conversations. So some of the phone conversations do talk about culture.
They thought I passed out. They were slapping me. They were slapping because I was
And thinking about culture as this abstract thing, this wallpaper, but then also being oh, that's what it looks like in reality. There it is on the floor, it's a net. Or that's the thing you're calling culture, is this really violent, a violent history, or one of the things that I'm really interested in is this history of trauma, or this history of patterns of repetition that happen within a family, and how those sort of play out. I'm probably done. I'm probably out of time.
We're about there, yeah.
All right. I think that's everything I had to say. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
So you kind of talked about how you learn a lot about yourself through your work, but is there a specific piece in terms of introspection that you think is most significant?
Yeah, probably actually the recordings, going through those recordings was huge for me. I mean, you can imagine like if you recorded conversations with a family member, that would probably be pretty huge. But also just thinking about the first time I recorded my grandmother, like I said, I was 16. My mother had just died like a few months before. She really wanted to have like this heart-to-heart conversation. And I know this is being recorded, but I'm gonna be totally honest with you. I was like a really cynical teenager, and I was like, we just got a camcorder. I'm gonna ask Grandma about God, and she's gonna do some crazy shit. So literally, I had like this really cynical reason for even recording her. Like I was sort of like, oh yeah, like I had this cynical attitude toward religion. I had this cynical attitude about my relationship to my family, and even like talking to her. And in my memory of that conversation, you know, she just talked about some God stuff, and you know, like spoke in tongues, and oh, that was crazy. But I didn't, until I went back and listened to it, I realized when I listened to it, when I was making that piece, we have very similar views of religion. And like we actually, she didn't sound crazy at all. She was saying like quite normal things that I totally agree with now as an adult, but I just couldn't hear it. And thinking about memory and the way that our memories, like the way I remember that conversation, I would have held on to that memory of that conversation, just, oh, that's what it was. But having the chance to actually go back and listen to what that conversation really was, what really took place. Not that I really believe in like truth, but there's a recording, so you can't really argue with the recording. But my like really changed my perception of that moment, and also listening to how my reasons for recording her evolved over the years, and the depth of our conversations evolved over the years. That was really huge for me. Yeah.
Has your grandmother been able to see your installation?
Well, I actually sent her photographs of it. Yeah, so one of the recordings, which I haven't yet given them a list of which recordings are which, but one of the recordings was actually made just maybe a month ago, and it was after I sent her photographs of the installation as it was installed in my studio, and we had a conversation about that, and then she sort of apologized for all these things that came out of her thinking about this installation. So that's actually, and thanks for actually asking that, because it reminds me that that's a huge way that I've seen my art act as a tool for communication and a tool for like actually creating change, at least in the dynamics of my own family. So that's been like a very big thing for me. Yeah.
If there was one message you could communicate to us as viewers and participants, what would that be?
Oh, well, I don't think that there is like a set message. That's the thing. I mean, like I have very specific things that I was thinking about when I did each of the actions, especially in that installation. Every little strange moment there, I had a specific idea of, but I don't know, like saying it out loud now maybe feels like it would be taking away the opportunity to form your own experience of that. But I guess that the themes that I keep on revisiting are this idea of memory and how memory is constructed, and also like this, like I said, these like patterns of repetition that happen like generationally. And so those are the things that I'm really interrogating with that work. Anyone else? Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. You didn't really talk about a lot of these objects are from like a family home of yours that burned down, and some of these they're actual pieces that have come from your life. And so I think it's interesting that you're carrying this emotional baggage because of some of your experiences, but it's also very physical baggage. And so I'm curious, like, if some of these objects will continue to be recycled and kind of reinvented, or if this is going to like stay as a Sanct installation and somehow be moved past? I'm kind of curious, like your relationship to these objects, because they are very
That's
personal.
such a good question. That definitely requires a lot more reflection than this moment. But I did, Sasha's right, I did drive across the country with actually all three of those individual sculptures, the television and the piece with the shirt and the bed that's been compressed into this one object. And a bunch of scrap wood strapped to the top of my car. So I was living in Boston with my aunt in this house that I've lived in on and off with her. And it didn't burn down, thankfully, but it did burn a big hole in the side of our house. And actually that was sort of one of those moments where I thought, I've been working with this idea of a burned down house or like a destroyed home as visual imagery and as an aesthetic for years, and then all of a sudden it actually happened to my house. And I literally was like, cool, sculpture materials. And so my friends back here in California were a little creeped out because I kept on posting these cheery photos on Instagram as I'm snowed into my condemned house, of like photographing like the blankets nailed on the windows and being like, functional object number 3. And then like culling for sculpture materials in the kitchen, and they're just like rubble, digging through the rubble. So yeah, I guess it's art as a survival tool has also been like a big theme in my life. Art is a way to frame your lived experiences differently. Does that answer what your question is? Like those objects actually, basically everything there has come from various homes that I've lived in, either here in Los Angeles or in Boston or from my grandparents, from my grandmother.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Veronique.